Welcome to Brass Day. This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're diving into brass instruments and frequent challenges and suggestions that I have when I work with brass players. This is part of a larger series of Alexander Technique advice and experience for different instrument groups. So, when we're talking about brass, by the time they get to here at a university level music school, we have to talk about marching band. So on lesson 1, when a new student comes in, and all of my lessons are one-on-one, so we really have time to dig into what are your habits, what are you doing, what are you needing to work with. They come in lesson 1 and I ask them, okay, deliberately broad question to see how you answer it. What habits do you have that you're aware of? For a lot of my wins in brass, many of them at this point will go, habits. Well, I marched, so, and I say, okay, got it. Sufficient. I get it. Marching is a whole universe that comes with a extremely strict movement culture. There are some marching bands that I've seen who I think do it well. They tend to be from New Orleans, and they tend to be ones that allow a little bit of dancing. They might think of it as just moving with music and being able to be here with your various different instruments, where they're not asking for stiff, upright, strictly vertical at all times. And there's a lot of problems with that mentality. When I see folks who come in who did marching band, what they've been taught is my instrument equals tension. My instrument equals overwork, especially in my back and my shoulders. I refused to march as a flute player when I was in high school. I didn't want to do it because this was in Georgia and I had no desire to be outside in 100-degree heat and 95% humidity and playing flute. That sounded awful. But I knew a lot of people who did, and I went to a lot of their games and watched the shows and everything, so it's a culture that I'm very familiar with. And it has major repercussions down the line that I find a lot of my job as an Alexander Technique teacher at a music school is to deprogram and to help them get away from getting locked into this idea that marching band, and if you're not doing it well enough, then you're lazy and you're being weak and you're not good enough. It's very there. I had some really interesting conversations about brass culture and kind of gender roles and gender coding with a student who was a brass player who happened to be transgender. And as he was talking about this, it was so interesting that we were working with this idea of openness and being able to have openness, especially in your torso and your back as you're breathing. This was a horn player. And so as he was working with, can I actually allow my back to move as I breathe rather than getting locked into my shoulder blades must stay at the one specific place compared to my seat, which is how a lot of them are taught to think about it. Don't let your shoulder blades come up. Well, they end up holding them down. So as he was working with this, it was so interesting to hear from someone who has a different perspective on gender roles and the physicality of gender within musicianship. It was one of the coolest lessons I've ever gotten to teach, talking with a trans man about brass gender-coded culture. The way he described it was so much of what he's been taught as a brass player has been, do it. It comes with this kind of emotion, and you gotta get in there, and you gotta have grounding with your feet, and then you bring your instrument up, and it's very testosterone. And he actually used that word, and I thought that was very appropriate with what do I actually see physically in terms of habits, as well as mentally from the verbal descriptions from my brass player students. What are they doing? So we're gonna dive into that, and at various points we might talk about how's this different than marching band specific habits. It's very hard to mimic brass instruments because they vary so much in size, and I don't have them handy here. So I can mimic roughly a trumpet, something like this, with my nice tiny boom whacker here. But other than that, we're just going to have to kind of mime. So when we're dealing with standing instruments, this is where marching habits can really come in. So this is especially going to be with trumpet players, some trombone to a lesser extent, and then with tuba players, if they played sousaphone, which is the big one that wraps around them and has the huge bell coming up, it works a little bit differently. But one of the main things that I see with the smaller instrument brass players is this. Watch my back. Don't focus on so much where the instrument goes. Watch my back. This is where they end up. So, one way to describe this is arching the back. Other people might see that and say you're lifting your sternum. Well, let's dive into that. Can I actually separate my sternum from my spine? Nope, they're attached and the ribs are U-shaped. It is not physically possible to make the ribs do this, to actually bring the sternum separate from the spine and actually increase that distance there. So when we breathe, breath is mostly sideways diagonal. It's not forward backward. What's happening in my spine here, watch the distance and I'll show you that arch again. Watch the distance between my middle upper back here and my sacrum, where the bottom of my spine connects to my pelvis. Use my trumpet. So I'll just show you one more time. It shortens the distance. Mechanically, the only way to make that happen is with tension. Mechanically, muscles can't push, they can only pull or release. So that means the only way to get my middle back to get closer to my sacrum is to tighten in between. And that's what my brass players do, really consistently across the board. So the reason that this matters is because when you're trying to achieve openness in your breath and freedom and mobility of breath, as well as long-term sustainable injury prevention in something that you're doing for potentially 6 hours a day for 40 years, if you're consistently asking these bones in your vertebrae in your middle to low back to do this, of course it's going to hurt. Of course you're going to get tired. That's how bodies work. It's not weak or lazy to say that we can adapt this. That isn't actually necessary. So one of the things that I find I work with brass players on a lot is this idea of an upward diagonal in a V shape. So coming from the low spine, I'll show you on my front so I can face you. Coming from the low spine, up and out. And keeping that going on my exhales. And I'm still absolutely able to breathe. We shouldn't lose any breath support or any functionality with this. What we're avoiding is introducing extra tightening unnecessarily. So that's a lot of what can come up in the mid and low back. We're going to look at this seated as well in a moment. What's happening up here? Well, for folks who did marching band, they tend not to go towards the instrument with their necks because they're taught not to do this. But the way that a lot of them are taught to do it instead is hold yourself in place. Hold your neck back, stand up straight. What happens if I actually try to straighten my spine? Watch this. So here's my normal, my neutral. If I want to straighten this part would need to go this way, this part would need to go that way, this part would need to go this way, and this would need to do something like that. Does that look sustainable to you? Nope. Your back's not straight. No Alexander Technique teacher who knows what they're doing will ever tell you to stand up straight because it's not a helpful direction to use. So when I'm working with brass players and we're talking about the neck, a lot of this is going to come down to this idea of leave it alone. I trust my brass players by the time they get here, this is a university music school, they're not going to do this very much. They've been taught not to at this point. With beginner players, middle school, high school, yes, I would definitely talk about coming up, allowing lengthening along the front of the spine to be able to bring the instrument to you. By the time they get here, though, they're not really doing that. So a lot of it is coming back to this idea of doing less and openness. We also practice moving just the arms, and I do recommend you do this with an object that is not your instrument. So find a thing that you can move around and practice just coming up into playing position, moving from way out further on your arms than this hollow space right in between your shoulder and your rib cage. Your shoulders come from a little further out than that, and it's really useful to practice that movement because this allows you to learn keeping your collarbone area open as you move your arms. It's the same thing we also talked about with winds, various different wind instruments. Same idea. That when I'm coming up into playing position, no matter where that playing position is, it doesn't have to mess with this. Anytime you're messing with bottom of pelvis to soft palate, you're messing with your air column. Support does come from down here. This is relevant, absolutely. And we can leave it alone. So with my brass players, I work a lot on openness. I work a lot on the idea of doing less and doing less work. We practice this first for several weeks away from the instrument, working with bending, working with walking, reaching for things, because this is all part of playing the instrument. I've got another video that I'll put a link to in the description of working with instrument cases. This absolutely applies to brass players as well, so please check that out too. So a lot of brass instruments are frequently played seated. So that's the next thing we're going to look at. All right, seated brass. I'm going to put myself slightly diagonal so you can see me a little bit of what my back is doing here. Most brass players don't do this by the time they're in a university. This is a very classical focused music school, so in a orchestral and wind ensemble kind of concert band setting, like they're not doing this by the time they get here. They're not here. But a lot of them are the opposite, and it's the same as the marching band habits. And even for those of them that didn't march, I find that a lot of them will have a similar habit of overarching and trying to lift the sternum, and I think that just comes from how they're taught and mimicking other players that they see. A lot of brass players will find it helpful to sit at the edge of the chair. I certainly do, and I teach that to my brass players unless they are especially tall or just large and built big people. And that's frequently going to be low brass players. A lot of them are bigger guys. My suspicion on this is it comes from just who was big enough to be handed the big instrument as a kid. Who do you hand the tuba? The one who can hold the tuba. So there are some players who are just bigger people than I am, significantly taller and broader as well, where when they sit in this chair, which is the one that's used for large ensemble rehearsals, so orchestra, wind ensemble, they're using this. They sit all the way at the back of the chair, and their feet are flat on the ground, totally fine. And mine swing like a 5-year-old. So I don't find it helpful to sit back here. But if you're a large enough person to be able to do that, totally fine with me. What you need to check in with, if you're going to use the back of a chair, is that you're still coming up from that, and that you're not staying here and then needing to curl in on it. I will typically see this not so much with classically trained brass players, at least by the time they get here, but every once in a while this can still come up. The other time that I see this habit come into play is especially in orchestral playing. There's a lot of time you're not playing. What do you do during rests? I am totally fine with orchestral players using the back of the chair to rest when they're not playing. There's a lot of times in orchestral rep where you've got, multiple movements of some, symphony type piece, and brass are not playing. So if you're going to use the back of the chair, allowing yourself to be a well-distributed banana, allowing this curve to have lengthening to it, rather than going into collapse. Making sure that what you're doing during the minutes that you're not playing are still helpful brass things. It's not that you have to lock yourself in vertical at all times, but coming back to this idea of how can I make sure that I'm not doing things that are unhelpful? What is unhelpful? Collapse. Putting large bends in my spine that don't need to be there. So being here, totally fine. I'm lengthening, I still can breathe really well. I can feel that my belly can move. When I'm collapsed here, my rib cage presses down on my belly, and my ribs aren't able to move well, my belly's not able to move well as I breathe. This isn't a helpful place to be. And it's also going to make me want to introduce neck tension to be able to still look forward, which is going to pull my skull back and down, and it puts pressure on the back of my neck. You can also hear that the longer I'm in this position, the more my voice is actually getting a little strained, and I'm going into vocal fry just a little bit. Compared to here, it's different. What about our large brass instruments? Things that really can't be played standing up. So especially tuba, but even things like bass trombone are generally, like, you're going to be seated most of the time you're playing this instrument. There's not a whole lot of solo rep for it. So when you have a big instrument, such as tuba, big, bass trombone, things like that, giving yourself room. You're allowed to take up space. You don't have to try to tighten yourself in, but also check in. If you are using an instrument that the height of the mouthpiece is not adjustable because of your arms, such as a tuba, make sure that the height is at a place where your embouchure is neutral compared to your own neutral in yourself. You're going to have to find that away from the instrument first. So with all brass, and all wind instruments at all, wind and brass, find the neutral first, and then bring your instrument to that, no matter what that position is. So my upright neutral really doesn't have to change much depending on the specifics of where my arms are. So if we're working with something like a horn, I can still allow widening in my back. I can still let the floor do its job of supporting my legs. Let the chair do its job of supporting my torso so that I'm not pulling my legs up. I'm not attempting to levitate. And especially with my brass players, avoiding the temptation to arch the back, because it's not helpful. When I breathe, a lot of this breath comes from widening across my middle back. It's this way. This is a really effective breath. Another thing to check in with is with brass mouthpieces, how are you approaching your breath compared to keeping your embouchure in place? So the way I generally go about this is to first ask each individual player, how do you think about this and what are your goals? Because if a student says something like, right now in my lessons with my major professor, I'm really working on keeping my embouchure locked in as I breathe so that I don't have to reset it every time, I need to be okay with that as an Alexander Technique teacher. I'm not their major professor. I don't even play a brass instrument, so I need to be okay with, right now, this is the skill that they're working on in their lessons. So what we talk about instead is, let's do some brainstorming. How can we still allow the instrument mouthpiece to be here, and when I breathe, I'm avoiding doing this. So to describe that verbally, this is lifting the skull back away from the instrument in order to get enough room to get in air so that you can breathe to play the instrument. The problem with this is there is no lifting muscle. that would be up here. I do not, in fact, have a unicorn horn in order to lift my forehead. Mechanically, the only way to be able to do this is by pulling my skull back and down in the back. So, breathing by lifting the upper jaw and upper teeth is frequently a way to think about it, away from the instrument is neck tension, by definition. It's the only way to do it. Introducing extra neck tension into your playing is not helpful. It might feel normal, and this is where we get into this idea of comfort versus ease. Your comfort zone might be something that's very informed by what you're used to, and it might feel normal. It might feel like this is just how I play, this is comfy for me. And then they get into Alexander technique lessons, and I say, I question that. If you're open to experimenting, let's try a couple different things. Let's try just opening up around the mouthpiece. We can try dropping the jaw. In general, what we're thinking of in our priority system here is I'm avoiding doing things that are unhelpful. That's it. Other than that, there isn't anything in particular that must happen other than the sound's got to come out of the instrument and it's got to sound all right. We're avoiding something unhelpful, which is excess neck tension. So when we've got a mouthpiece that's sitting here, it might mean playing around with moving the instrument just slightly away from you. That can be slightly sideways, depending on what you're playing and what your technique is. Or if you're going to leave your instrument exactly where it is, can you open up around that? This is a little too big for me to really show you, so I'm going to just ease a finger here. That was a full breath, and I didn't tighten my neck in order to be there. This is also something I work on with wind players. So from my background as a flute player, with the instrument here, I have to allow the instrument to move. And that takes practice. This is not easy, but it's important. That's a flute breath. It's dropping the jaw and opening up just a little bit on the sides. I might not want to totally reset the sides of my mouth, so I might not want to go into an E. That's not going to work very well. It's not a very effective breath. So I can still keep the sides of my embouchure fairly well set. I don't need to mess with this a whole ton. But I don't have to introduce neck tension along the way. All right, so for ye brass players, things to keep in mind. Marching band habits frequently are harmful, and you're allowed to not do them anymore. Checking in that you are not arching your back, which can often involve narrowing and actually kind of locking ribs into place. Letting yourself open up and breathe with your back as breath comes in, and also allowing the ribs to move back down again as you exhale through your breath. And then when you're working with embouchure versus breath and the eternal battle of being a wind or brass player, checking in, can I ask my neck to do less so that I'm not introducing excess neck tension into the requirements for my instrument? Give it a try, see what happens.